All right. Well, good morning. Actually, for you nice people, it's afternoon. For me, it's morning. I'm going to talk about the U.S. Supreme Court's Dobbs decision about abortion in the broader context of comparing individual rights and different perspectives on individual rights in different countries. It works. Wonderful. Great. The United States had, and you notice I'm using the past tense of the word had, the US had a constitutional right of access to abortion for almost 50 years. From 1973 until 2022, the US Supreme Court held that the US Constitution included a right to abortion. That federal, in other words, constitutional right, prevented state governments from prohibiting abortion and limited the types of restrictions which could be imposed. Now, today, when I use the term state, I'm referring to one of the 50 state governments. I understand that in Europe, sometimes people refer to a state, such as a member state of the European Union or member state of the Council of Europe, as being a national government. But today I'm using the term state to refer to one of the 50 governments like Texas or California or Florida. Well, in Dobbs, the US Supreme Court overruled its 1973 decision in the landmark case of Roe v. Wade, and the Supreme Court held that there is no right to abortion. That decision did several things. The effect of that decision was very broad because that decision allows the US state governments, to prohibit abortion or severely restrict abortion. And the broader concern is that it also threatens to eliminate other individual rights in the United States as well. I'm not, for some reason, I don't seem to be moving the slides. Let's see. Okay. All right, great. All right. After the Dobbs decision, different states in the United States acted in different ways. Some states enacted laws or enforced laws that imposed very, very severe restrictions on access to abortion. Some states prohibit abortion. Now some states prohibit abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy, at which point many, maybe most women would not even know that they're pregnant. Some states have no exception for rape or incest. Many of these state laws are really, really severe. But at the same time, some other states that are more supportive of individual rights took action in their states to protect access to abortion. Sometimes that was by means of state legislation, or sometimes provisions in their own state level, their state constitutions. And there's a good map I've cited here in this first bullet point, Center for Reproductive Rights. In the references to the slides, there is a link to an interactive map of, if you're interested in the abortion laws, up to date new information about abortion laws in any particular US state, that link will take you to a big map and you can click on the state and find out information about what's happening. So the point is, we've become very, I guess you might say balkanized. We've become basically 50 different little countries where some states do things one way and other states do things other ways. It depends very much on what state you're in. And so I point this out because when I talk about the Dobbs decision is so terrible and it's so upsetting. It's so negative, but I also want to point out that I don't want to be too negative about this. There are people in the United States can take action at the level of their state government to try to improve access to abortion and other individual rights. And people are doing that. There are things that lawyers and non-governmental organizations and politicians can do and are doing at the level of state government. Thank you. What about the federal government in Washington? Well, the federal government has tried to find ways to protect access to abortion, but this has been very, very frustrating. President Biden issued executive orders to express his administration's policy to promote reproductive rights and to suggest actions that should be taken by the various federal agencies under the authority of President Joe Biden's administration. Unfortunately, none of those suggested actions would really restore the balance. It would not restore the law that existed before the decision in Dobbs. And so the federal government effort to try to protect access to abortion has been very frustrating for federal officials and for advocates for abortion rights. And the reason it has been so frustrating is because the authority of the federal executive branch, the federal administration, executive branch, is the authority, their competence is very limited in this area. And perhaps Congress could do something, but that is not really realistic because the US Congress is sharply divided along party lines and they really cannot take action. And so today I'm going to talk about first the implied right of privacy in the US Constitution. And I'm also going to talk about some structural barriers in the US Constitution that prevent majority rule. The US Constitution, we'll talk about then in the broader context of international human rights. And we'll talk about the Dobbs decision and the majority of the court, the right-wing, extreme right-wing majority on the US Supreme Court, they made in their decision 3 misrepresentations. The word misrepresentation is a very pretty word. It's a way of saying something that's not really completely a full explanation. Misrepresentation means that somebody knows something is not true, but they say it anyway because they want to convince people that it's true, but they know it's not true. We have another word in English for that. It's called lie. And so really, the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs is based on 3 lies, or what I would call 3 big fat lies. Sometimes in the United States, we say liar, liar, pants on fire. So we'll talk about the Dobbs decision and the 3 big fat lies. Okay. I'll talk first about the implied right of privacy in the US Constitution. And okay, great. Well, the United States Constitution has no explicit right of autonomy to make medical decisions. We take for granted that we have a right of autonomy to make medical decisions, but there's nothing in our Constitution, in the US Constitution, that says that. And in addition, there is no explicit right of privacy in the Constitution. But for more than 100 years, from the late 1800s, the US Supreme Court recognized an implied right or an implied zone of privacy from the late 1800s until 2022. And this concept of an implied right of privacy had nothing to do with reproductive rights, but it had to do with family rights and the rights of individuals and the rights of parents to control the education of their children. And it's a very interesting issue, because a very interesting history of this right, because a lot of it has to do with people who came from Europe to the United States. We are a country of immigrants. Everyone in the United States is either an immigrant or the descendant of an immigrant. People came to the United States from many countries in Europe. Some people came to the United States from countries where they spoke German. And after they arrived in the United States, they wanted their children to learn to speak German, not instead of English, but in addition to English. But some state governments said, no, we will not allow young children to learn languages from other countries, because then they will think like people in other countries, and that's bad for America. That was a terrible idea. And the Supreme Court said, no way, you cannot do that. People have the right to decide what language their children will learn in addition to English. And that it was based on this new idea, this implied right of privacy, this developing idea. So it was not originally based on contraception or abortion, but it expanded over time. The implied right of privacy expanded over time to include the rights to marry a person of a different race, and then access to contraceptives, and then abortion, and most recently, the idea of marriage equality for same-sex couples. As I mentioned, the right of privacy expanded in steps. We tend to do things in incremental steps. So in 1965, the US Supreme Court held that the state government could not prevent married couples from receiving medical advice about contraceptives from their doctor. That was against the law before 1965 in some states. Then the next incremental step was to say, well, if married couples can get medical advice from their doctor about contraceptives, then what about unmarried people? Okay, now unmarried people. And finally, in 1973, in Roe v. Wade, the US Supreme Court held that a state abortion law from the state of Texas violated the right of privacy under the US Constitution because the state law only allowed abortion to save the life of the mother. And the US Supreme Court said that's not good enough. That violates the implied right of privacy. That was the case of Roe v. Wade, and it was followed up about 20 years later by a later case called Casey, C-A-S-E-Y, Casey, and that sort of fleshed out the details of Roe v. Wade. The US constitutional right to abortion stopped state governments from prohibiting abortion. In terms of politics in the United States, many of the state governments in the US are controlled by the right-wing Republican Party. And many of those states want to prohibit abortion or severely restrict abortion. Go to the next slide here. The court decisions in Roe v. Wade and the subsequent case of Casey were a balancing of individual rights and state authority. Those court decisions were a balancing, and that's what we do so much in health law and medical law. We balance the rights of the individual against the rights of society represented by state authority. If, for example, if a person is injured and needs a blood transfusion to save their life, but refuses to get a blood transfusion because of their religious belief, we balance the rights of the individual against the rights of society. Same thing with vaccinations or COVID-19 regulations. And that's what Roe v. Wade did. Roe v. Wade was a balancing of reproductive rights on one hand and state power on the other. And it was a compromise. A lot of people think that a compromise makes everybody happy, but in reality, a compromise makes everybody unhappy, but less unhappy, not as unhappy as they would have been without the compromise. And that compromise existed for about 50 years. I'll go to the next slide here.
Mr. Dean, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can we pause for 2 minutes because we have double translation in one channel? We try to figure out, and in 2 minutes we continue. Is it okay?
It is no problem at all. I'm here.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Колеги з технічної підтримки, я прошу вас перезавантажити перекладачів для того, щоб вони не потрапляли в один канал. Дякую. Шановні колеги-адвокати, я перепрошую за незручності. Так бувають технічні проблеми, іноді заважають підвищувати якісно свою кваліфікацію. Пауза на 2 хвилини. Так, Олеже, і переклад, і оригінал в одному каналі якимось чином. Так, але в YouTube-трансляції 2 голоси. Зараз ми спробуємо розібратися. Mr. Dean,
Yes, sir.
can you try to say something? We will check if it's okay.
Okay, I'm going to read the heading here. Former President Donald Trump made the U.S. Supreme Court more right-wing.
Mr. Dean, I'm sorry, we have a problem with translation. Just give us a minute to figure it out. Maybe it will be just your voice. I will ask our colleagues if it's okay in English without the Ukrainian.
Okay, if that's the case, then I will try to speak a little more clearly and slowly. But just let me know, I'm here.
Yeah, just one. Колеги, підкажіть, будь ласка, колеги-адвокати, підкажіть, будь ласка, чи буде нормально, якщо захід відбудеться повністю англійською мовою? Напишіть, будь ласка, в чаті, чи ви підтримуєте таку ініціативу. Колеги, підкажіть, будь ласка, якщо захід відбудеться англійською мовою без перекладу, чи підійде такий варіант нам для підвищення кваліфікації? Прошу написати в чаті. Колеги, підкажіть, будь ласка, якщо захід відбудеться англійською мовою без перекладу, чи підійде такий варіант нам для підвищення кваліфікації? Прошу написати в чаті. Mr. Dean, we decide to do our event only in English, so the floor is yours. Sorry for interruption.
This is not a problem at all. Do I have control of the slides, or I think maybe someone on your end needs to advance them? Okay, great. I think someone else is doing this. Good. Thank you very much. All right. Former President Donald Trump made the U.S. Supreme Court more right-wing. Well, Trump is out of the White House, at least for now, although he still thinks he won the election. He still thinks he's president, but he's not. But he left us with a legacy. One of his legacies is a very right-wing Supreme Court. I don't like to say conservative or liberal because those terms mean different things to different people. And even within the United States, it may mean different things. So I like to use the concepts of right wing and left wing. The legacy of Donald Trump is that we have a very, 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 very right wing Supreme Court. I wanted to put in a lot more very, 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 but I did not have enough room on the PPT slide. And that is why Roe v. Wade was overturned, because the majority on the Supreme Court changed. All right, next slide, please. That decision by Roe v. Wade was contrary. It went against what the vast majority of people in the United States want. More than 60%, 60%, almost 2/3 of all Americans say that abortion should be legal in all cases or most cases. And 70% were opposed to the court overturning Roe v. Wade. Now, I am not suggesting that the Supreme Court should have conducted an opinion survey and said, what do people want? We will make a legal decision based on what everybody wants. That is not what I'm saying. They should make the decision based on the Constitution and the laws. But what I am saying is that in a democracy, the citizens should be able to change the laws to make the laws conform to the opinions of the vast majority of people. If the courts are making decisions that go against what the public wants, the vast majority of the people, we should be able to change this through the political process. Unfortunately, in the United States, we cannot solve this problem by the political process. This is a complication. This is a problem of our democratic system. There are weaknesses in our democratic system. Our Constitution, the US Constitution, does not guarantee free elections. The Constitution does not guarantee fair elections. And in fact, the US Constitution imposes significant barriers to majority rule. And I'm going to the next slide here, please. In the United States, there are some things that we do pretty well, but there are also some things that we do not do very well. And I am going to be really honest with you, and I'm going to tell you the truth about some of the weaknesses in our constitutional system and some of the problems that we still need to solve. We have some problems involving our elections, our legislation, and the way we choose judges for our court system. Now, we have made a lot of progress in the United States in the past 200 years. The most important was probably getting rid of slavery, stopping slavery. And we've made other accomplishments like voting for women, the right to vote for women. But we still have more things that we need to do to make our system work better. These things take time, but I think we are moving in the right direction. I really like the saying that Martin Luther King Jr. used to use. He would say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. It's taking us time, and we still have more to do. We've made some progress, but we have more to do. And so I'm going to be honest, I'm going to try to explain what some of the problems are, some of the weaknesses in our democracy and our system of elections. We have 4 basic problems, and these problems are imposed by the Constitution. We have a very old Constitution that was started in 1789, even before 1800. And we've made some important changes, but we still have the same basic Constitution from more than 230 years ago. I'll tell you what the 4 big issues are, and then I'll talk about each one in a little more detail. We have a system for electing the president of the United States called the Electoral College. And unfortunately, what that means is that the president is not necessarily the candidate who got the most votes of all the people. You can get the most votes, but the other guy can be end up becoming the president. That's one problem. Another problem we have is that the US Constitution allows each state government, like the government of Texas or the government of California, to control the procedures in elections for federal offices, including elections for president of the United States. So we do not have a system in the United States, we do not have a procedure for electing the president. We have 50 separate procedures, one in each state, and sometimes the government of each state is controlled by a political party that wants to make sure that their candidate wins the elections for president or US Congress, and they manipulate, they use their control over the process to control the outcome of the election. Number three, the US Senate is the upper house of Congress. And in the Senate, states in rural areas, states out in the countryside that have small populations, very few people, lots of cows, but very few people, they have more power than states in, more power per person as compared to large states with big cities and a very large population, because in our system, every state has 2 senators, even if you have very few people in your state. And finally, courts in the US are often very political. They are not necessarily neutral. Courts can be very political. Okay, well, going to number 1, the next slide. I mentioned the Electoral College. This is a terrible system. It was created back in 1789, and the last time it was changed was in 1804. And maybe it worked or maybe not in 1804, I don't know, but it certainly does not work today. This system can override, can outweigh the will of the majority of voters. Each state has specified a certain number of electors for president. Now, when I think of electors, it makes me think of the Holy Roman Empire in Europe, which I understand the French philosopher Voltaire said it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But we still have electors. And I'll show you what happens in this last bullet point. You see in the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton got millions more votes, about 3 million more votes than Donald Trump. But Donald Trump became president because he got more of these electoral votes. So you see what a problem this is for democracy and majority rule. Go to the next slide here. And you might ask, you should ask, why don't we change this? I'll go into the next slide here. Why don't we get rid of this electoral college system? If we can go to the next slide here. And the answer is that there are some states that like the system because it gives them more power than they would have if we had just a pure majority rule. All right, I need to go 2 slides forward. One more slide. Okay, right, good. Thank you very much. State governments can use their power over federal elections to prevent majority rule. Back when the Constitution was created in 1789, these little states, we used to be, the United States used to be 13 colonies of England. There were 13 colonies of the English king, of the King of England. We had our revolution, and those little colonies became, for a few years, were independent countries. And they realized that does not really work. You could not really have these 13 little independent countries. So they created this new thing called the United States of America, a new country. And they gave a lot of power. They left a lot of power in the hands of the states. Thank you. So as I mentioned before, I am not just talking about the states' control over their own elections for state officials, like the governor of the state or the legislature of the state. It's more than that. The 50 state governments control the rules for elections for federal offices, like the President of the United States and members of Congress. So we really have 50 different systems for our federal elections. Each state government has a lot of control over the qualifications of voters. Who is allowed to vote? Well, it depends which state you live in. Some states are more flexible, other states are less flexible about who is allowed to vote. There are procedures, there are issues about procedures for voting. In other words, how people cast their ballots. Do you have to go on election day on one day, or can you vote over a 2-week period of time? Do you have to show up in person, or can you send it in the mail? These are very political issues because there are different the people who vote for different political parties like to vote in different ways. And sometimes the state government wants to they will adopt rules and procedures for the purpose of making it difficult for the other party to get votes. And they also control the districts in which votes are counted. And that totally affects the outcome of the election. Okay, going to the next slide, please. We call this vote suppression. They want to suppress the vote. All right, reality here. The Republican Party does not have a lot of popular support in the country as a whole. They know, politicians in the Republican Party know that if we really had free and fair elections and majority rule, they would lose. They want to keep their power by preventing people from voting if those people would vote for the Democratic Party. So they impose restrictions. They use their power over at the state government level to impose barriers to voting for people that are more likely to vote for the Democratic Party, such as minority groups. Some states have very complicated rules for being registered to vote. Or if you don't do something that the state thinks you should do, they cross you off the voting rolls. And the state officials that want to keep themselves in power might cross off 50,000 voters but it's only the voters who are likely to vote for the other party. We have laws that require some types of identification to vote, but it's some types of identification that certain people are not likely to have. And there are limits on methods of voting that are used more often by other people. For example, people who are more likely to vote for the Republican Party, the right-wing Republican Party, generally like to vote in person on election day. Excuse me. People who are more likely to vote for the left-wing Democratic Party like to vote by mail or on a day earlier than the official election day. And so the state government, if the state government is controlled by the Republican Party, they adopt laws at the state government level to make it more difficult to vote by mail or make it more difficult to vote on Sunday. A lot of Black people, African Americans, like to go to church on Sunday, and then they march together to the election office and vote together. They call this souls to the polls. Well, Republican politicians know that they do this, and they don't like it because they know that Black people usually vote for the Democratic Party. So the Republican Party passes laws at the state government level to make it difficult or to impose barriers to voting on a Sunday. this is the kind of tricks, the kind of manipulation that people do to try to control who wins the election. Next slide, please. And they also, many state governments prevent majority rule by what is called gerrymandering. Gerrymandering, I don't know if that's a term that's well known. Gerrymandering refers to drawing the lines for voting districts in a way that gives an advantage to the politicians who drew the lines and their party. If you have the power to draw the lines for the voting districts, then you have the power to control who wins the election. By using gerrymandering, or well, I should say, ordinarily in a free and fair democratic election, the voters choose their politicians. But in gerrymandering, we say the politicians choose their voters. The politicians are involved in drawing the maps with the lines to say, I can win if we draw the line like this. We put more of my people in my district, we take those other people and move them into a different district. This is named for a governor of Massachusetts named Elbridge Gerry. He approved a voting district in 1812 that somebody said looked like a salamander, like a little lizard. If you can go to the next slide, please. I don't really see it as a salamander. This is what it looked like. This was a drawing of this. To me, it looks more like a dragon. I would call it like a dragon man. But then again, I should say the reason everything to me looks like a dragon is because I watch a lot of Harry Potter movies. So to me, if it's like Harry Potter movies, it looks more like a dragon. But that's how this works. Next slide, please. And the US Constitution says that's okay. This applies not only to the state government, but it applies to the state government control over the federal House of Representatives. The state governments control the drawing of the districts for electing the members of the federal Congress, federal House of Representatives. And the US Supreme Court says, okay, fine, that's fine with us. So that's in the Constitution. The Constitution says state governments can do it. That's what they said in 1789, so we're stuck with it. That's not a good system, but that's what we're stuck with at this point. Next, okay, where are we? Okay, I just want to say, I've been talking, this is very negative. I'm telling you all these bad things. The Dobbs decision is horrible and we have problems with our Constitution. But I want to tell you a good thing that happened that gives me some hope. As you probably know, Donald Trump still insists, he still thinks he's president. He thinks that he really won the presidential election in 2020. He thinks that the election was stolen and that there was voter fraud. All of that is a lie. It's all a lie. Well, he still believes that, and his followers still believe that. What Donald Trump tried to do in 2022, when we have a midterm election, presidential elections every 4 years, we had a presidential election that Joe Biden won in the year 2020, we'll have another presidential election in 2024. But in the middle of the period, the 2022 midterm elections, Donald Trump tried to put his followers in positions of authority in state governments. First, I should tell you, there are only about 8 states that make a difference. There are only 7 or 8 states out of 50 that have any chance of affecting the outcome of a presidential election, because we know that California will always support the Democratic Party candidate. New York will always support the Democratic Party candidate. Texas will always support the Republican Party candidate, and Oklahoma always supports the Republican Party candidate. But there are about 7 or 8 states that really control the outcome of a US presidential election. The followers of Donald Trump and his followers, they tried to take control of the state governments in the those 8 states, 7 or 8 states that are the swing states, the contested case. They wanted to put their own people in charge of the 2024 presidential election in those swing state governments. And those people that were supporting Donald Trump and his people, they insist that Donald Trump really won the election in 2020. And they promise that if they are put in charge of the election office in those states, that Donald Trump will win the 2024 election, regardless of what the votes look like. They basically tried to take over the system to say, we don't care about counting votes, Donald Trump will win. Those people did not succeed. I was very pleased to see that the voters in those 7 or 8 swing states just strongly rejected Donald Trump and his people, because most of us in America, we are satisfied with an election. We want elections to be won by the person that got the most votes, not decide in advance. So I am more optimistic about the future because Donald Trump and his supporters did not succeed in taking over the state governments, and they did not succeed in becoming the person in charge of the election in their state. So that's a good thing. We can go to, okay. I have to go back 2 slides back. I'm sorry about this. I need to go back to number 22. Yes, perfect. Thank you very much. As I mentioned, we have 2 houses of our legislature, our federal Congress. The upper house is the Senate. The problem is that the Senate is controlled by small states, not by the national majority. This was something that was decided in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention. See, we are still stuck. We are still prisoners of our history. The most controversial issue at the Constitutional Convention for the states that created this new country was how much power to give each state in Congress. And it's understandable that the states that had large populations, they said we should have more representation in Congress. But the other states, the small little states, they say, no, we should have equal representation. They came up with something called the Great Compromise. It's not a great compromise. It's a terrible compromise. You cannot make it great just by calling it great. Like I could call myself Dean the Great or Dean the Magnificent, but it doesn't make me great or magnificent. The Great Compromise said we will have 2 houses of the legislature, the House of Representatives and the Senate. In the House of Representatives, a state gets more representatives, more members in the House of Representatives if they have a larger population. But in the Senate, we have equal representation where you have 2 senators from every state. The problem is you really cannot do anything in the US government without agreement by the Senate. It's not like I'll go to the House of Representatives and ask them. No, I'll go to the Senate. You have to have both for most things, and you almost always need the Senate. So you cannot do anything without the approval of the Senate. Next slide, please. This is a problem because of 2 kinds of unfairness. This creates numerical unfairness and racial unfairness. This compromise of giving 2 people, every state 2 senators, it violates principles of majority rule and 1 person, 1 vote. We like to say you should have 1 person should get 1 vote. This violates the principle of majority rule and 1 person, 1 vote, because what it means is that people in small little states have more power per person than people in large states. How much political power do people have? It depends on what state they live in. For example, we have a state out west called Wyoming. I have never been there. I understand it's very, very pretty. Lots of nice scenery, lots of cows, but they only have 600,000 people. Those 600,000 people in the state of Wyoming are represented in the US Senate by 2 senators. They've got 2 senators. The people in the state of California, where they have 40 million people, are also represented by 2 senators. So the 600,000 people in Wyoming have the same amount of political power in the US Senate as 40 million people in California. This is not majority rule, and it's not one person, one vote. But there's another problem that's just as severe and even more, maybe even more severe. The little states, the states with very small populations, which have more, they are overrepresented, they have more power in the Senate. They are mostly rural states. In other words, states out in the countryside, out in the mountains, in the desert, where the population is almost entirely white people. In the larger states, we have a much more diverse population, people who are Black or Hispanic, Latino, or immigrants from different countries. But the rural states with low populations that have more power in the Senate are mostly white people. Frankly, they are also mostly, they're not as well educated. They do not have as much income. They do not have as good marketable skills for a global technology economy. So those people have more power over the US government than people who live in California or New York or Massachusetts. All right, final point here on the next slide is that our court system in the United States, unfortunately, is often very political. We want, as lawyers, we want our courts to abide by the rule of law and to be neutral, not political. But in the United States, the federal judges and the justices of the Supreme Court are chosen by politicians. The Supreme Court justices and all other federal court justices first have to be nominated by the president. Remember, the US president is a politician, but not necessarily the one who got the most votes. And then the Supreme Court justices also must be confirmed. They must be approved by the US Senate, where those people are politicians, and the states with small populations of mostly white people have excessive power. And that's why sometimes our courts make decisions that are clearly political, absolutely outrageous decisions, but just for reasons of politics. What about state courts? State courts are even worse because in many of the states in the United States, including my state of North Carolina, judges are politicians who run for election, and people decide to vote. Do I want to vote for the right-wing judge, or do I want to vote for the left-wing judge? And so the courts are controlled by politicians who are elected as right-wing or left-wing. And sometimes the issue in state courts is there a majority on the state court who are right-wing judges or a majority who are left-wing judges, but it's totally political. This is not how you would want it to work. All right, if we can go to the next slide, please. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the US Constitution in the broader context of international human rights. I've talked about the US Constitution on its own. Now I want to talk about the US Constitution in the broader context. Well, as you know, there are positive rights and negative rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights includes positive rights and negative rights. Positive rights refers to entitlement to receive benefits from society like food, housing, and healthcare. Negative rights refers to protection of individuals from oppression or interference by the state, such as arbitrary arrest, torture, or interference with rights. All right, if we can go to the next slide, please. A very interesting statement was issued on the website of the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has essentially, they don't say it in those words, but they have essentially created a third category in between negative rights and positive rights, or at least they have modified the concept of negative or positive rights. I'm not sure exactly whether it's better to see it as a third type of rights or just as a modification. But there's now really three concepts here: the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill. You'll see in this second bullet point here, the obligation to respect means that states, governments must refrain from interfering with or curtailing the enjoyment of human rights. That is a classic definition of negative rights. The state should not go around arresting people or interfering with their rights. You'll see in the last bullet point on this slide, the obligation to fulfill means that states must take positive action to facilitate the enjoyment of basic human rights. That's the classic definition of positive rights, the idea that society has an obligation, the state has an obligation to provide people with access to food and housing and healthcare and social security. The interesting change, the interesting modification here by the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights is this obligation to protect. The obligation to protect requires states to protect individuals and groups against human rights abuses. What is missing? What is not there in that bullet point about protect? It does not say protect against human rights abuses by the state. This is a very important concept, a very important change, because according to the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations, governments have an obligation to protect people against human rights abuses by people and groups other than the government. You'll see how important this is when you see what the United States will not accept. For example, maybe a person's rights are being violated. A person's human rights might be violated not by their government, but by an organized gang of criminals, a criminal drug gang that goes around killing people. Or perhaps the people violating their human rights are a non-government militia, the armed militia that is not part of the government. So this is really interesting because it adds something important to the idea of positive and negative rights, the idea of an obligation to protect people against human rights abuses by people other than the government. If we can go to the next slide, please. You'll see that the US Constitution, looking at the US Constitution in the context, in the broader context of these rights, you'll see how limited the US Constitution is. The US Constitution only provides negative rights. We do not have positive rights under the US Constitution. There are no positive rights under the US Constitution. We only have negative rights. In other words, the government in the US, federal government and state government, cannot do bad things to me, but they have no obligation to do good things for me. So our Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments to our Constitution, says that government may not take away the rights to freedom of speech or freedom of the press or the right to bear arms, which allows people to walk around with guns. But the Bill of Rights, the US Constitution, does not provide any positive right, such as Social Security or health care. If we can go to the next slide, please. So, for example, the US Constitution does not provide a right to health care. The US Supreme Court ruled in 1989 that government in the US has no constitutional obligation, no obligation under the Constitution to help an individual, even if that individual would die without the help. So if you are dying of some disease or you're starving to death and you throw yourself on the steps of the government in the United States and say, help me, I'm going to die, please help me. The US Supreme Court says, nope, that is not the government's obligation. The government has no obligation. What the Supreme Court said was, if agents of the government, if the government was trying to kill you, if the government was trying to make you die or beat you up, then yes, the government would violate the Constitution because the government, that's the concept of negative rights. The government may not hurt you, but the government has no obligation to help you if it was not, the harm was not caused by the government. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see how different this is. No, okay, I'll do this first. Okay, we'll get there. You might ask, what about human rights? What about international human rights treaties and conventions? The United States is not bound by any enforceable conventions that impose positive human rights. This is not just a Donald Trump problem. This has been a problem for generations in the United States, for decades. There is only one country that is a member of the United Nations that refused to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Is that Sudan or Somalia or North Korea? No, it's the United States. The United States did not ratify the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Sometimes the United States will ratify a convention, but only subject to certain limitations, or say that the agreement is not self-executing unless you have domestic implementing legislation. And so this is very different. As you know, members of the Council of Europe are bound by the European Convention on Human Rights. I understand that for many years, Ukraine has been a member state of the Council of Europe, but the United States is not a member of the Council of Europe or any comparable organization. All right, next slide, please. And so you'll see how this makes a difference in practical terms. As I said, the US Constitution imposes no duty to protect against harm caused by other people. So I'm going to tell you about two similar cases, one in the United States and one in Europe, and you see how different the outcome is between the United States and Europe. This is a wonderful example. Of course, when professors talk about a wonderful example, it means something really horrible happened, but it makes a good teaching tool. In both of these cases, the father in the family was committing domestic violence against the wife or the children, beating the children, causing serious, almost fatal illnesses, almost fatal injuries on the children. And in each case, the government knew about it. The mother called the authorities, reported the father to the appropriate government authorities, but the authorities did not stop the father from attacking the mother or the children. In the United States, in the case I mentioned before, the DeShaney case, the US Supreme Court said that a state government has no obligation to protect a child from abuse by his father, even though the state knew about it, because it was not agents of the state who were causing the harm. So no violation. The state knew about it. The father was beating the children, caused the child to have brain damage, but no violation of the Constitution because it was not the state that was doing the damage, and the government has no obligation to protect the child. Contrast that, compare that to a case in the European Court of Human Rights, the DeGiorgi case was DeGiorgi v. Italy, where similar circumstances, the father was beating up the family, violently attacking the family members, other family members, the wife and the children or both. And the government knew about it, and the government did not stop the father, or did not even try to stop the father, apparently, from harming the family members. The European Court of Human Rights said this violated Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights involving inhumane and degrading treatment. So you see two very similar cases. In America and the United States, no violation of the government's obligation because the state did not have an obligation to protect people. And in Europe, yes, the state does have an obligation to protect people. So I found that very interesting. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, please. You're probably wondering, I hope you're wondering, why in the world is the US Constitution so different from constitutions and laws in other countries? And there are a few answers. First of all, the US Constitution has been in effect since 1789. That was long before the development and acceptance of the concept of the modern social welfare state, in which government has a role in helping people and improving society. In 1789, what we call the US founding fathers, and unfortunately they were all fathers, no mothers, generally they wanted government to leave them alone. They had their land and their money and their businesses, and some of them owned slaves and some of them held people in slavery. They wanted government to leave them alone, and they wanted to limit, they wanted to restrict the power of this new federal government. Okay, well, that was 230 years ago. In more than 230 years, only 27 amendments have been made. And those 27 amendments did not completely change the nature of a constitution that was based on negative rights and very limited federal power. We've had some very important amendments, like no slavery, or women can vote too. And we've had some very stupid amendments. The worst was the one that said, no beer, wine, or alcoholic beverages allowed in the United States. Thank you very much. That did not last very long. We had a period called Prohibition. You may have seen this in the movies with gangsters, and it was violent. It was outrageous. People did not comply. And then so finally they went and said, okay, we hereby repeal that amendment. Now you can have beer, wine, and whiskey anytime you want. It's up to your state. None of these amendments, and only 27 amendments in 230 years, that's not a lot. That's not a big change. Most constitutions of countries in the world today are relatively new, or they have been changed significantly after World War II. When the United States passes an amendment to the Constitution, the process is like this. I have my stapler. It's basically a stapler. You take the old Constitution and you attach it to the back. You do not say, now we have a new Constitution. No, it's basically, there's a guy in Washington who is, metaphorically speaking, who has a stapler, and he staples that one to the back. And it's only happened 27 times in 230 years. Next slide, please. Why don't we change it?
I'm sorry,
okay?
Professor Dean, sorry for interrupt. We have a few minutes more, so if it's okay to finish our lesson today.
Yes, I understand. We'll stop at 10:30. Is that correct? I'm sorry, for you, 5:30.
Actually, we have 60 minutes and plus technical issues. So if we can finish in 5 minutes. Is it suitable for you?
I will do it. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I misunderstood.
Thank you.
I did not understand what the timing was. I apologize. Okay. I'm going to move. Can we move forward, please, then to slide number 37? Okay. In the Dobbs case, start by saying there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. 5 justices out of the 9 voted to overturn Roe v. Wade. Of those 5, 3 of them were appointed by Donald Trump. Why did Donald Trump appoint 3 justices who would overturn Roe v. Wade? Is it because Donald Trump is such a religious person? Is it a religious faith? No. Is it a policy? No. Donald Trump made a deal with some very conservative religious groups that he would nominate justices to overturn Roe v. Wade if they support him in the 2016 election. And they did that. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. Technically, the issue in Dobbs involved the concept of liberty. The term liberty is not defined in the US Constitution. And the right-wing majority took a very, very limited view of interpreting what this term liberty means. And the dissenting justices, the 3 justices that wanted to keep abortion rights, they took a more flexible view. If we go to number 41, please. And so if you read the decision in Dobbs, it appears on the surface to be a debate about legal theory. It appears to be a debate about legal doctrine, how to interpret liberty, with the majority in supporting a very narrow interpretation, but that's just a fake. It's not really a discussion about legal doctrine. That is not how they made the decision. That is just an attempt to justify a decision about abortion that had already been made even before this case started on the grounds of politics, culture, and religion. It's a sham. It's what we call window dressing or a pretext. The decision was not really based on legal theory. They're just using the legal theory to try to justify their decision. And the way we know that is because there were three misrepresentations, three big fat lies. Next slide, please. So supposedly the Supreme Court said, we're overturning Roe v. Wade because we want to allow people to make decisions through the democratic process. That's nonsense. That's a lie, and the Supreme Court knows it, because by giving the authority to state legislatures, to the legislatures of the state governments, the legislatures of state governments do not represent the people because of that problem of gerrymandering. The Supreme Court knows about that. They're well aware of it. So they're really lying when they say, we're going to let the people make the decision through their state legislatures in the democratic process, because it does not represent the will of the majority. Next slide, please, was the idea of supposedly they're leaving the decision about abortion to each separate state. And on its surface, it might seem reasonable to say, well, if California wants to allow abortion, let California allow abortion. If Texas wants to stop abortion, let Texas stop abortion. It's what I think people in Europe might describe as a broad margin of appreciation. But this is all a lie for two reasons. First of all, reproductive rights and other fundamental institutional rights must be protected by constitutional law. It should not be different in one city from another. It should be protected by constitutional law and not preserved or discarded based on the outcome of every election. And the second problem is that the state option, this idea of a state option, let every state do what they want, it's a lie. Because what the anti-abortion people really want, what a lot of the anti-abortion groups in the US really want, is one federal law that applies everywhere in the United States to prohibit all abortion and prohibit the sale of abortion pills in every state. So when the Supreme Court says, oh, margin of appreciation, let every state make it, that's a lie. That's not really what's going to happen. Next slide. Claiming that overruling, the Supreme Court says, well, we're overruling Roe v. Wade, but that does not affect any other rights. That's a lie, because the legal standard, the very, very restrictive legal standard that the Supreme Court created, is a legal test that would mean that under that test, there would be no more access to contraceptives, no more equality for same-sex marriage, because of this very restrictive test. So they're lying when they say this only applies to abortion. All right, next slide, please. Bottom line, the conclusion in Dobbs, the decision in Dobbs did not end the debate about abortion, but rather it set in motion a wide range of controversies. We're going to have more lawsuits to clarify if there's any more role for the federal courts and any more remaining boundaries on the authority of state governments. And finally, if we look at this from the perspective of comparative law, the United States provides a good example of what happens when a long-standing legal right that people have had for 50 years is quickly, abruptly canceled with very little guidance about what should happen next. And you'll see, I think it's a good example, by which I mean a really horrible example. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening. And I want to thank you for helping with all the technical arrangements. I appreciate it very much.
Professor Dean, it was excellent. Thank you very much. We have a few feedbacks that your English is very available and understandable, and you are very charismatic, and the information that you provide is very unique and useful for our Ukrainian lawyers. So from the Higher School of Advocacy, I want to thank you for your job, excellent job. And our lawyers ask in the chat if it's possible to continue to meet with you one more or a few times more. So they'd love to. It's your decision. So
okay, we can communicate with email about scheduling.
Right. So
Okay.
thank you, Mr. Dean. It was a very good job. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.